And it looks like we are live. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah Gottwallace, and I am one of the co-chairs of the Dr. Talbot Spivak Holocaust Memorial Committee. I'm also a historical professor, a history professor here at FSW, and I'm a Holocaust historian. So it is my great pleasure to present to you this afternoon the curator of the Holocaust Museum and Cohen Education Center, Cody Rademacher. Cody is a graduate student of Florida State University's Historical Administration and Public History program. After earning his degree in 2011, he began to work with the museum in 2012, and he's been there ever since. In his time there, Cody has overseen dozens of in-house installations and creations. Boy, that's fun to say. And he has mentored interns and worked tirelessly to form and perfect the museum's archives and exhibits in its new location. And this also includes, by the way, over 1,000 generously donated pieces and artifacts from our local community. Today, he's going to be sharing with us some stories and some artifacts pertaining to displaced persons at the close of the war. During the presentation, if you think of any questions or comments for Cody, please go ahead and place those into the comment box or the chat box within YouTube, and I'll be sure to relay those to him after the presentation is complete. So without further ado, hand it over to you, Cody. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you so much to Florida Southwestern for inviting me to speak on this very unique, very interesting subject, because we think of, at least in a pop culture sense, we think of World War II is over, we're moving forward, things are progressing again. But there was this period, especially in Europe, as we will talk about in a little bit, where people sort of were trying to figure out where to go, what to do, how to survive, honestly. Because after the war, it's estimated up to 10 million people were displaced by the conflict itself, by the actions of the Third Reich, such as the Holocaust and other programs that forced people to move, as part of things also like their Germanization program of like Eastern Europe and things like that. And even the expulsion of ethnic Germans from other countries based on agreements designed in the Potsdam Conference that actually occurred before the war was over in Europe. So you see this massive sort of culmination of the conflict, the atrocities, and international agreements that could easily be considered their own atrocities in their own ways. That's another whole discussion, I will admit. But those all played in to lead to millions of people across Europe away from their hometowns, their homes, their home countries. And then the Allies, especially the big four allies, we're talking Soviet Union, we are talking Britain, France, and the United States, they all sort of had to administer this and manage this on so many levels, on top of rebuilding their own economies. So as a little bit of primer, it's like after World War II, Germany, Austria, and Berlin were all divided into four separate zones, based upon those big four I just mentioned. So you had, we're going to focus particularly on Germany. So you see in the Northwest, you see the British zone, and primarily in the Southwest and central areas, you see the American zone. Along its borders, you see the French zone. And then in the East, surrounding Berlin even, you see the Soviet zone, which later became East Germany. And you see a similar type of division occur in Austria and Berlin. But we're going to focus primarily on the American zone today. Why the American zone? Because unsurprisingly, being in America, having American naturalized survivors and American GIs, we see that experience more directly. So immediately after World War II, they started first developing these displaced persons camps. You also see a push for distinct camps for groups that were particularly targeted during the Holocaust. Initially, based on, again, international agreements such as Potsdam. You see them combine people based not on like an ethnicity or a religion, but based on country, because their ultimate goal initially was, let's get these people home, take them back, Ukrainians to Ukrainians, Polish to Poland, Soviet POWs to the Soviet Union, French to France, etc. The problem with that was when you had Jewish survivors of the Holocaust intermixed with their other countrymen. So a great example of this really comes from the Polish designated areas. You still saw anti-Semitism develop and be used against those survivors who were already suffering from physical and psychological trauma from being survivors alone. So you have the trauma of the Holocaust, then you have the trauma of being in camps. Sometimes they are just renamed concentration camps with their fellow countrymen being persecuted even still. And then to throw on top of all of this, you have times when people would return home, find their house lived in, be threatened that if they didn't leave again, they would be killed. So they fled back to occupied Germany. That was actually about 150,000 people left Poland alone because of instances like this, with the most notable being the Kielce pogrom, where dozens of people were actually killed, and you saw this mass exodus of the Jewish population of Poland again. Very scary times, and it's these moments that actually really galvanized the Jewish community that remained, also known as the surviving remnant early on, to advocate on an international level. You see them talking with American representatives. You see them reaching out to relatives and community groups in like the United States, who then pressured our government to review what was going on in the displaced persons camps, in particular to Holocaust survivors. And because of that work, Harry Truman actually sent over a gentleman by the name of Earl G. Harrison, who wrote, frankly, a scathing report and some very distinct recommendations on what to do to improve the lives of Jewish displaced persons. One of the two biggest ones I would say, honestly, were caloric count increase. So everyone was being rationed at this time, ranging from just basic food staples all the way to cigarettes and fuel and things like that. So there's huge rationing programs going on, and because of that, a black market developed. And the other thing is they developed distinct camps. And there were many camps across the Western zones, most of them being in Britain, most in the British zone, most of them being in the American zone. And like we talked about, we're going to focus mainly on the American zone today. So sum that all up, there's the division of the German state, the former Third Reich. And you see thousands, millions of people moving back and forth in not only this zone, but from their home countries to and from, based on their own perceived feelings of safety, their ability to house themselves, the ability to survive. And ultimately, you see the development of a distinct camp system specifically for the Jewish community. And we have quite a few objects in our collections that directly connect to this. So I'm putting on my handy dandy blue gloves so I can handle these safely, because a lot of this paper, which we jokingly refer to as wartime paper here, it's not of the best quality. It is very what's referred to as acidic. So there was a lot of materials as they broke down developed acids. So we have to be very careful when handling these objects. And the first item I'm going to show you is actually from the Stewart Nest collection. Now, Stewart will be speaking tomorrow to a high school, if I remember correctly. So that will be a great opportunity for those students to hear a little more about it, and directly from the son of a survivor. Now, Stewart's father, Joel, he actually lived in and survived the Lodz Ghetto, Auschwitz, and Dachau. So he actually can trace his path based on where they forced him to move and what they forced him to do, because he was a forced laborer in Lodz and other sites. But when he got into being a displaced person, he really didn't have much paperwork. Unsurprisingly, you don't have much paperwork when you survive a genocide. You're lucky to be alive at that point. So organizations had to figure out how to document what happened to people. And this was a big push from the very beginning. So we have here a declaration from Stuart Mest's father under what was called the Central Committee of Jews in the American occupied zone. So this is specifically an identification form. It describes Joel as a person, where he lived, where he was imprisoned, and a variety of other things, including his displaced persons card number and various other things, saying that I am Joel Mest, this is what happened to me, and this is where I was held by the Nazis. And you see a similar kind of documentation develop in these displaced persons camps. But one thing that is especially interesting about this is that it came from the Central Committee of Liberated Jews. This was a distinctly American organization, or American zone organization, I should say, because unlike some of the other occupation zones, the American zone, because of like the Harrison Report and sympathy towards what occurred to the Jewish population once liberated, you see this desire to give them autonomy. And you see this drive really initially coming from those who survived. They want to govern themselves. They want to have control again. They want to very much have, for lack of a better term, self-determination, even if they are just the council in this chunk of Germany at the time. So through Stuart Mest's collection, and always a little nervous when it's out of its file folder. So through things like this, you see them asserting and recording even a little bit of personal history that helps not only someone like Joel document where he was, who he was, and sort of help him rebuild on a personal level, but it builds a argument for responsibility and autonomy, I would argue, in justifying a lot of things for the Central Committee, saying we are doing this for us. We are wanting to do what is best for survivors. And part of that is knowing what happened and what we can do to help people. So we see that and a lot more from when Joel was in his own camp, in his displaced persons camp. So thank you very much, Stuart, for that. The next person I'd like to talk about has an interesting connection. It's sort of a ships in the night kind of connection, I would say, because Stuart Mest's family has distinct materials from what was called Feldafing. That was one of the many displaced persons camps. And our next person we're going to talk about, a gentleman by the name of Abraham Rosenfeld. He actually was at Feldafing. Now, at the same time, I can't confirm offhand, but through his collection and through specifically the kindness of his wife, who donated these materials after his passing, we get to show you one of the cards that was actually at Feldafing Displaced Persons Camp. It documents who he is, that he can actually enter and exit. There's various stampings, including from the Feldafing sort of organization, and is a great example of the materials that they would actually document, saying, even to the point that, yes, Mr. Rosenfeld was actually in Auschwitz and Dachau, and this card was issued at this time. It has stampings from specifically the camp administration, as well as the Red Cross, showing all these organizations that needed to verify information, I would argue, with Mr. Rosenfeld. And the fact that it had, again, authorization by the Feldafing administration, I think, again, shows that assertion that they are wanting to be autonomous, at least on some level, that they can take care of themselves after this, this horrible event that we call the Holocaust. And along those lines of, again, asserting oneself and wanting to do and express themselves and take care of themselves, again, from the Rosenfeld collection, we have an absolutely wonderful periodical called Free Again. So this, again, is from Abraham Rosenfeld's time as a displaced person. This was produced by displaced peoples in Stuttgart, Germany. It's actually on very surprisingly nice paper. Again, with rationing whatnot, I think that is why on the inside it says it was approved by the UN at the time for publication. It is completely in Yiddish and actually documents quite a bit of material, including poetry, prose, art, as well as photography that was taken after liberation, and then a commentary and things like that while in the camp systems. And this is one of multiple of this periodical Free Again. This is specifically the January 46 edition. And an interesting aspect is there are notes galore actually on the backside, most likely between friends, family, acquaintances, and Abraham Rosenfeld himself, because he never actually really looked at these materials with his wife. He kept these to himself, and that was very much a very private thing for him. And that's something along the lines that you see with some survivors. Bringing these things and sharing these things can be very traumatic. And it's unsurprising that they sort of wanted to move on after a certain point, even if they were still dealing with the traumas, both in a physical and a psychological sense. So even the fact that he kept these, but kept them very privately, can say something, and we can infer things from these and sort of look into those and at least have avenues for research. So we're very fortunate that Mrs. Rosenfeld was kind enough to donate these materials to us. And the last collection I would like to look at today is actually one that has a lot of connection for me. It is not my own collection or anything like that, but it is the one that really inspired me to look at the Displaced Persons Era. And when I say the era, I really do mean an era, because this was from 1945 to 1957. The Korean War ended before the Displaced Persons Era ended, and that's the best way I can put it. This was a huge amount of time where people remained away from homes or having any home. Many were stateless, in a sense, or they refused to return home, understandably. And those people needed support, and they needed help. And we saw this through a very generous donation by a gentleman by the name of Michael Levine. Michael Levine's father had 6 albums from his time after World War II. And one of them in particular comes from the Jewish GI Council of Frankfurt, Germany. And is specifically referred to as a photobook. We have the reference copy, as it was referred to, from a binder of various materials, primarily photographs and descriptions of displaced persons camps in the Frankfurt area. And these cover a wide variety of materials. It shows the documentations of the camp conditions. It shows how people are surviving, people are sort of living again, cultural events, things like that. And one that really interested me is, if you're familiar with the concept of the kibbutz, it is a collective farm primarily associated with Israeli life, and especially early Israeli life. You actually see these kibbutzim develop in the Displaced Persons Era as well in Germany. So you see these collective farms in the outskirts of the Frankfurt region and near the displaced persons camps themselves. And a powerful one I actually have. This is actually from what is called Kibbutz Buchenwald. And it's actually people dancing the traditional Hora dance at Kibbutz Buchenwald. So you see this revival of skills, revival of trades, training, but you also see cultural aspects develop in these camps. The revival of traditional cultural dances, poetry, song, arts, things like that. And this was not just for the kibbutz around kibbutz and displaced persons camps around Frankfurt. You see this across the different zones. There were traveling theater troupes. They were writing new plays. They were making new songs. They were getting involved politically on a national, like a local, a national, and even an international level at one point. And it's all, fortunately, very much documented by this wonderful collection that Mr. Levine donated to us. And I'm looking for one additional photograph I would like to share with you. Yes, that's the one I'm looking for. So, one interesting aspect that developed during this period really was a focus on children. In a sense, in that sense, a focus on the future. And the displaced persons support groups such as the GI Council very much focused and emphasized their support for these children. They wanted to take care of them. They wanted to support them, educate, prepare them for a new world, a new life beyond just being in a displaced persons camp. And you see this again across the board. International organizations such as the trade training group WORT took care of school, took care in both adult and children education. And through the GI Council, through ORT, through the Red Cross even, you see this support for children in particular, because there was actually quite a few children in these camps, because the Jewish DP camps had the highest birth rate in the world at the time. And as noted Holocaust scholar Michael Barenbaum puts it, you don't have kids if you don't have hope. And that's what you really see with their documentation of like children's events, outings and things like that, is even these people who are looking to support from the outside, they want to see these kids grow, thrive, survive, and live what we would consider normal lives. So it's very powerful stuff. And it's through the Levine Collection I first learned and started researching the Displaced Persons Era. So I'm very grateful to the Levine family for donating those in particular and getting me to learn about this very interesting, and I would argue, under-researched time, at least in the public sphere. It is not understood nearly as much as we think, as maybe scholars would. But yes, so through Stuart Mest's family collection, we see how they began to organize and document what occurred to survivors. Through the Rosenfeld collection, we see not only documentation of people through the ID, but we see how they were expressing themselves through, in this case, a printed periodical. And then finally, we see through the GI Council's work, we see how people lived and ultimately began to rebuild. And it's important to think that even though I'm talking about rebuilding, rebirth, growth, this was all being done by people who survived the Holocaust, survived a genocide. And even though they were trying to move forward, they still dealt very much with psychological and physical problems associated with their mistreatment and the atrocities committed against them by the Nazi government. And that is why even to today, you see restitutions being done. You see them as early as the 50s and going into today for people who survived. This, as they again referred to very early on, as the surviving remnant. I'm not going to say it in Yiddish. I don't think I can pronounce it well. But again, this concept of the surviving remnant out of the Jewish population, it's a powerful one. And it's amazing to see what people were able to do despite the trauma inflicted on them. And well, it's become an absolutely fascinating thing for me to research and learn more about. So thank you so much for that today. I thank you for listening. Does anyone have any questions? I'd be happy to answer anything about the collections, about the Displaced Persons Era, things like that.
Thank you so much, Cody. It was wonderful, wonderful. I especially like your recap, the way that you go back through and showed everything and reminded us once again, of how all of the stories connect and fit together here. So we do have one question to start us off here. Ashrith would like to know, what's probably one of the favorite stories that you have heard and worked with at your time at the museum?
In general, I would say that's actually my very favorite, I would say, is specifically the Simcoe's family connection or survival of Kristallnacht, where his father, using quick thinking and talk, actually sort of almost smooth talked looters from looting their home, and eventually got a receipt for the things they did take. I would say in particular for the Displaced Persons Era, I think one of my favorites actually comes from our very first employee here, Hadassah Schulman. Her mother survived Auschwitz and was a tailor by trade. She ended up making from the coat she wore while imprisoned in the concentration camps, Hadassah's first coat when she was born in Landsberg Displaced Persons Camp. That I would say it's between those two, because it's absolutely wonderful and shows the resourcefulness. Also, it shows the kind of need, you were repurposing materials as much as possible because that's all you had. And then with the Simcoe one, it shows again, sometimes stories about the Holocaust are almost humorous because of, again, who would have thought of looking at two people in military, paramilitary uniforms, these brown shirts at the SA, and been like, hey, it's my birthday. You guys must be tired from looting. Please come on in. We'll have coffee and cake. So those are, I would say, my two very favorite. One specifically of the Holocaust, one specifically of the Displaced Persons Era.
It's great. Thank you. Folks, just if you have any questions, keep those rolling in here in the chat box while we're waiting for anything else to roll in. I would say one of my questions that I'm thinking of that, other people might have the same type of question, this just to clarify. We've heard numerous stories of children who were placed in hiding or hidden children, and perhaps their parents were captured and sent to concentration camps. If the parents were able to survive within the DP camps, were there resources where they could find their children and reconnect with their children? I know I've heard stories of the child being able to write and have that maturity, if they're old enough, to go looking for mom and dad, or mom or dad at the DP camps, and writing all these letters to all the various DP camps. But were there resources at the DP camps for parents to look for their children and try to reconnect with their children?
There were some, such as organizations like the Jewish GI Council of Frankfurt. That actually was one of their major things, was to try to help find families, both in the U.S. zone and abroad, if capable. You also saw what was known as the Joint Distribution Committee, also known as the Joint, that did a lot of work to document and to try to assist those who were either looking to leave or at least try to find family. So you saw some non-governmental organizations and even some governmental organizations, such as UNRRA and the International Refugee Organization, which was its successor, trying to help people sort of reunite. And it's interesting you bring up specifically the survival of both parent and child, because there's also some unfortunate stories where children, after surviving the Holocaust and after living as a Gentile effectively for X number of years, they actually don't want to go back because they saw what happened. So there's good stories where families were fortunate enough to reunite. Sometimes that reuniting was mother and child, father and child, or sometimes, aunts and uncles and a surviving child. There's some of those wonderful stories, but then there's also some more tragic stories of people seeing what happened because of what their perceived race at this time, and not wanting to return with family because of the traumas they experienced in the separation. And it's tough. And those are some of the sadder stories from the displaced era in particular.
There were a lot of those that I've read with the kinder transport, especially, and it's very difficult if you have a child who was separated from their parents at a young age and they've grown up with other people. Now they don't recognize their birth mother as their biological mother. This lady who has cared for me for the last 5 or how many ever years is my mother. And there were those heart-wrenching stories of, well, you're their parents now. This is what's best for my child.
Exactly.
We have one question from
Yes.
Kelly. How many other Holocaust museums or memorial sites have you been able to visit since working in this field, and which is most memorable? And which do you still desire to visit? Sorry.
Well, I would like to visit quite a few, honestly. I have close contacts with the Maitland Museum, which is just north of Orlando. I would say the most profound one personally that I visited was probably the St. Petersburg Museum, which we're working more and more with. We're trying to be more in touch with as we all try to, we're all in this together. So I don't want to play favorites, but it's like I've had very good rapport with both Maitland and St. Petersburg. But when it comes to visiting, I had a wonderful experience when I was visiting as part of the Florida Association of Museums conference. And they had a great exhibition specifically on civil rights in Florida during the 60s, which was really profound for me. And I found that to be not only their permanent exhibit about the Holocaust, but also talking with I believe it was Dr. Blankenship, and seeing their exhibitions on civil rights in particular, which was powerful because even included materials where a Jewish man working in the county was just saw on his desk one day a KKK uniform, because it was like, oh, you're in this county government. It's expected that you're going to go to this rally. And he donated it eventually. He never wore it. He never went or anything like that, but he was able to dodge it for his entire career somehow. But he eventually donated it to the Holocaust Museum there. So seeing their push and understanding on human rights as civil rights and things like that was really powerful for me. So I'd say that's my favorite. I've only had the opportunity to visit that. That's really the main one I've visited. We've tried to schedule with other organizations, but then, things get in the way. But we've tried to maintain close contact with Maitland, the Danube Beach organization. Those are the main three that we've tried to maintain good contact with, even if we haven't had a chance to visit.
Yeah, there are some really museums all across the state of Florida here.
Exactly.
You want to give a little plug for your museum, the Holocaust Museum and Cohen Education Center?
Oh, of course. That's what I'm here to do, right? No, in all seriousness. But yes, Holocaust Museum and Cohen Education Center. We're just north of Immokalee Road on US 41. Our exact address, if you would like to put that into your phone, is 975 Imperial Golf Course Boulevard, Suite 108. And we're open Wednesdays through Sundays, 1 to 4, last entry at 3 o'clock. You can find out more information at hmcec.org, or you can Google Holocaust Museum Naples. We should be the first thing up there. And if we're not, I'm going to have to do some searching and wonder what's going on. But in all seriousness, if you're connected to people who survived the Holocaust, or have family that were part of the displaced persons experience in general. We are always looking for that kind of material and looking for those stories so we can share them with our community to say, look at this person, look at this person who just lived up the road or just south of here or in Fort Myers, or even as we go as far as Sarasota. We joke that we're starting to hit some territorial boundaries with St. Pete once we hit that area. But we are always interested in hearing those stories. And if there are materials that you're not sure what to do with, we'd at least be happy to speak with you, to consult with you. And if it's something you would wish to donate and fits within our collecting goals, we'd be happy to take a look, assess it, and accept it in. We're always interested. So if you have any questions or anything like that, you can always email cody@hmcec.org. When it comes to artifacts, when it comes to care concerns and things like that, because we want to help you. We're here to help the community, help them understand not only the Holocaust, but to inspire action against bigotry, hatred, and violence. Because ultimately, that's what we're trying to prevent. We're trying to prevent small-scale bigotry, hatred, and violence from becoming large-scale in the form of ultimately genocides.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Folks, we have dropped the website for the Holocaust Museum into the chat there. We've also got some comments in the chat. Thank you so much for your presentation. This is great information. Thank you so much for what you do. We appreciate your dedication and the work that you do. So that's always good to hear that what you're doing matters.
Thank you.
Speaking of keeping things close to home and whatnot, I don't want to ask too many questions. If anybody else has a question out there, keep in mind you can post those right in the chat box there. But something that I think might be beneficial for people to know and think about as we are getting a little bit closer to our family heirlooms, I think, at least that's what I see with my students. They care about having, grandma's wedding dress or their great grandmother's, bread recipe. What are some of the best ways that we can protect our own heirlooms and artifacts? What are good storage and display practices to have in our own homes?
Good rule of thumb: if you want something that lasts a long time, you keep it out of light. You keep it in a stable temperature and humidity environment, and you keep it away from extremes of heat and cold where possible. So I always joke, don't have it in front, like in direct light of a window. I'm looking behind Sarah right now, and I'm like, even with those shades like that, it's a no go. But ultimately, what you want to do is create a stable environment that's not too intense in lighting if it's going to be displayed. That way, it has long-term, doesn't receive what we refer to as cumulative light damage. All light damage is referred to as cumulative and permanent in the museum world. So that is why if you come to the museum and you're like, oh, why is it so dim in here? Or anything like that, it's because I'm trying to do my job while also letting you see items. I always joke about that one because people are like, it's so dark. It's like, we've even had staff members being like, can you raise the light a little bit? I'm like, no, we can't. This is at its maximum for sensitive objects. And sensitive objects often referred to as photos, art, fabric, especially dyed fabric. Those are the big ones that are very sensitive. Anything that can be exposed to light and lose color fastness or start fading, things like that. Because even a pencil sketch, like if you have a nice charcoal sketch that someone gave you or something like that, that can fade over time just because of the ultraviolet light. The infrared can cause other damage, but the big one is ultraviolet, then visual, then infrared are sort of the big three that we worry about. If you're getting other forms of light and sort of those wavelengths, you got probably bigger problems because at that point you're going towards like X-rays and gamma rays. So you might want to think about some other issues at that point. But in all seriousness, when it comes to storage, we always recommend something. If you're looking to do long-term storage, you want to get something that's acid-free and ideally lignin-free, which is a chemical in wood pulp, just always is there. It takes a little more effort to get out, so it usually doesn't. But So that is what we usually recommend. So even just a box, if it's a family album, if you leave it in that box, it is now protected from light, a little more from fluctuations in heat and humidity, dust accumulation is never fun. And even to some extent, it's just an extra barrier for things like pests that love to nibble on like starches and glues, like leather, you name it. If there's something you're concerned about getting damaged, there's a bug that'll probably try to eat it. So even boxing up helps out. So, and if you want to display, again, I recommend not in direct light. A great spot, honestly, if you want a piece on display, is honestly next to windows. Like you'll see that quite often in historic homes. It's like, well, we don't want to damage this historic painting, so we're going to have it on display next to the window where you're getting minimal amount of light, but it's still visible. Things like that. Other than that, if you have further questions, again, do not hesitate to reach out to me. I'll be happy to answer. There's some that obviously get a little more specific, and there's some that are a little beyond my knowledge base. And that's when I would even consult what's known as a conservator.
Well, thank you so much, Cody. That's good information to have. And I'm sure that people will probably be emailing you saying, what do I do with this? What do I do with that?
And we'll be happy to answer them because, again, ultimately, we want to help the community, be it education of the Holocaust or even education on how to take care of things, because
absolutely,
we got to take care of these things if we want to be able to, have future generations take a look at them, understand them.
We are the keepers and the caretakers of the past. So,
exactly.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate hearing from you as always. And folks, stay tuned at 2:00. We're going to be hearing from the child of Holocaust survivors by the name of Sam Versano. And we have a presentation coming up about the Holodomor from Dr. Sandy Towers. And tonight at 6 p.m., we're going to be hearing from Dr. Paul Bartrop, all the way from Australia. He always does such a good presentation. I always joke and say that listening to Dr. Bartrop is like going to church, because it's always such a powerful lecture that's like a sermon. It leaves you really thinking about things. So if you attend the 6 p.m. presentation tonight, don't plan on going to sleep anytime soon, because you're going to be sitting there thinking and ruminating on everything that he just said. Cody, thank you so much for your time today, and we will see you next season that we do this.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you, everyone. You guys have a great day. And again, check out those events, especially the Bartrop one.
Yes, please. Thank you so much.